All right, here we go. Exodus 4 through 7. All right, yo, what up? Welcome back. We're moving along through Exodus. We're going through Exodus chapters 4 and then the first part of 7. I stopped there because the next part of Exodus 7 is when the plagues begin, and I figure I'll just handle the plagues in Egypt all in one video. So for today, what you get is a little bit more of the same, kind of fleshing out, if you will, Moses and Aaron's call as they are sent to Pharaoh to demand to have the Hebrews be let go. Of course, as we mentioned in the last video, God says that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. So he hardens Pharaoh's heart, upon these demands, even though a couple of signs and wonders are given. Moses takes a staff and throws it on the ground, and it turns into a serpent, and then the Pharaoh has his sorcerers come and they do the same thing, and there's a battle, and it all sounds super cool and dramatic. And if you've seen the film The Ten Commandments, then it is super cool and dramatic. Moses' staff serpent ends up killing the Pharaoh's sorcerers' staff serpents, and so they win. And I guess that's supposed to mean that God is more powerful, that Yahweh is more powerful than their gods. There is something that's important to understand here, that the serpent god has a particular place in the non-Hebrew theological and mythological lineage. This is part of the reason that the serpent is used in the book of Genesis. The serpent is one of the key kings in Sumerian religion, in Babylonian religion, and so the idea that God kind of curses the serpent and has power over the serpent is something that's extremely important to establish Yahweh's supremacy, right? And so again, I think you see something going on here with that again, God is the God of the Israelites is the one who has supremacy over the serpents, the other gods, so to speak, right? All right, and then so now moving on, what ends up happening here? And excuse the gnarly glare in my glasses, totally unprofessional, but fuck it, we're working with what we got. So I guess in this passage, I think one of the things that was most interesting upon this reading that I don't really know what to think about it in terms of there's some sort of conceptual depth or anything like that, but just it caught my eye, and it's this recurring trend that I'm seeing and that I think is often overlooked, especially by evangelical types, and then even I think most people who think they have some grasp or understanding of what the Bible is, whether or not you're part of the faith or you're a critic of the faith or whatever. But it's this idea that when Moses goes to Pharaoh, there's this extended discussion about the Israelites being lazy and not working. And then when Moses goes and makes this demand, then Pharaoh becomes even a more burdensome taskmaster, and he increases the amount of labor that they have to put out. Now, they're not going to have the straw provided for them for brick making. They're going to have to go and source their own straw. They're going to have to get their own straw on top of the quota of bricks that they have to make, which is still the same amount as before. So their workload is doubled or whatever it might be based on the fact that they have to go and source the straw. So it talks about how the Israelites are scattered all over the lands, going to try to source just any amounts of straw that they can so that they can then keep up with the demand to make the same amount of bricks that they were previously making, because they're under slavery here. Now, the word slavery means something I think quite different to what we think of today, and this is one of the problems. It's really difficult to take a word like slavery that has so much post-transatlantic slave trade connotations attached to it and then try to understand what it meant in a 6th century context, or even if it's written prior to that, a 14th century context. That doesn't mean that, the slaves then were eating cake and drinking champagne or something like that. But it does obviously mean that there's some sort of different arrangement between the slaves and the slave master. There are different understandings of the racial element, of the discriminatory elements and things like that. Not to say, again, that they're absolved from it and that those things didn't exist at that time, but I think that there's a lot of gaps that I personally am unfamiliar with. I know there's been a lot of work by Old Testament scholars that can tell you, like, what does slavery mean back then compared to what it meant for us, in a post-19th century, 18th and 19th century world, post-colonial world. So that's one thing. But what I did want to say that I did find some space for musing, let's say, some fodder for musing, was this idea that there's something interesting again about this socioeconomic relations, right? That part of the burdens that the Hebrews are experiencing are their socioeconomic burdens. And so when God is saying that he's going to loose them and that he's going to allow them to plunder the Egyptians, which I mentioned in the last video, and he's going to loose them from their chains, part of this is based on the fact that they're being socioeconomically exploited. It isn't something, I think when I was in the evangelical world, I just kind of always assumed it was like this moral evil. Like that Pharaoh was bad, he represented the side of Satan, and that the Hebrews were good and they represented the side of God. And I think we're kind of taught this. We're kind of taught this that the Egyptians represent the powers, the spiritual powers that are behind, and that the Hebrews represent the good powers that are behind, and that we're supposed to root for the side of God against the side of Satan, or the side of good against the side of evil. And there's this really simple dualism that's oftentimes established, I think. And I don't think that was just me. I think that that comes from the pulpit and from the pastors as well, whether intentionally or not. I think that that's there. And I think that that really misses out on what is materially going on, what is socially, what is ethically, what is psychologically going on in this story. And the story is clearly a tale of these people who are being socioeconomically exploited for their labor so that they can produce vast amounts of whatever it is they're producing, bricks, so that they can make buildings, so that they can build more kingdoms, so that they increase the vast wealth of the Egyptian empire. And of course they're bemoaning this situation that they're in, and they don't have any recourse to positive, or I guess to positive material standards of living, I guess we might say. Which is why they're promised to get into the land of Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey, which implies that it's just abundant, that it's there, that they don't need to work as hard for it, that they don't need to source it. They're still going to need to work to domesticate it or to gather it or to whatever, but nevertheless, it's a land of abundance, not a land of scarcity. And so I think that's really important, because in economic theory, this notion of scarcity is one of the founding principles that defines why conflict exists. In René Girard's mimetic theory, it's the idea that scarcity is what induces rivalry between people. I think we talked about this previously, that you want what you want because the other person wants what you want, and so there's a scarcity of resources that creates that conflict and that rivalry. And then of course you have Austrian economists who base their entire idea of marginal utility value, the law of diminishing marginal utility, that's based on the Robinson Crusoe idea that things are valuable insofar as they're scarce, and you find their value increases insofar as it has its marginal utility for you, right? That's why things are valuable. So again, this notion of scarcity is something that's really important to consider, and I think human beings are always afraid of scarcity, and one of the things that the Hebrews are promising in their writing of the text is that they will have a land that is flowing with milk and honey, that is not scarce. And I think we see this too in kind of Christian depictions of heaven, right? It's a place where there's no more sadness, there's no more tears, there's no more strife and conflict, and there's peace. The lion will lay down with the lamb kind of thing. Again, there's no rivalry, there's no competition, there's no tension that emerges from any kind of scarcity, whether that's scarcity of meaning or scarcity of value or scarcity of love or scarcity of spiritual connection or anything like that, right? And so it's always this struggle over that which is scarce that creates the tensions of the world, and the desire for that which is abundant, which is always that vision of the beyond, that thing that is just outside the grasps. And so I think that's extremely important here to consider. That's what's going on, is that there is this sense in which the Hebrews are overwhelmed by the burdens of the scarcity that is forced upon them by an oppressive system of slavery, and they're longing to get out of that. And if they're under Babylonian captivity when this is written, or even under Second Temple Judaism, things are still kind of precarious. They're still longing for that abundance. And I think what you get then in this hope for salvation is not just a liberation of the soul, which is how it's often going to be interpreted later, especially with Christians, but it's much more about a liberation of the oppressed, right? And I think you start to see that here, and we'll see that especially developed in the prophets, that when the prophets rail against Israel's sins, it's because they're not adequately overcoming that logic of oppression, but are maybe even proliferating it within their own kingdom, even though God had promised that they would, and commanded of them and demanded of them, that they would, one, inherit a land of abundance, but also that they would be people of that abundance. And when you are people thinking from that abundance, you think differently than a people of thinking from competition and rivalry, right? You're supposed to be much more gracious, you're supposed to be much more open, you're not supposed to be defined by rivalry and contention and competition and things like that. So that's really what struck my mind when I was reading this day's reading, that there is this socioeconomic element that seems quite integral to this story, and it's because they're slaves trying to get out of this horrible, oppressive, exploitative socio-economic system so that they can get into their land of abundance. And then, of course, we have to talk about Pharaoh's reaction, who's like, oh yeah, really? Well, fuck you. You want to be able... And really, their demands at first, when Moses and Aaron approach Pharaoh, aren't even that they would get freed. It's just, let us go out into the desert so that we can worship and sacrifice our God for a few days, for 3 days. Like, let us have a weekend, boss. And he's like, oh yeah, really? You want a fucking weekend? Fuck you. Now I'm going to double your workload. So it's really interesting, too, to think about how the taskmaster, how the boss, how the owner of the means of production, I mean, I know I'm using kind of loaded terms, but I don't think it's a stretch, how these individuals, or how this individual in this instance, responds. It's, oh yeah, you think you want leisurely? You're a fucking lazy bum. Fuck you, work harder. And I think that's quite telling, that it shows how this dynamic of exploitative power relations has existed for millennia, but how it operates in this context, how it informs then the Hebrew and the Israelite desire for liberation and freedom, and how it crafts the mythology in Exodus. All right, so that's what I'm going to talk about today. My chair is noisy, I've got glare in my eyes, and it's fucking blazing hot outside. Anyway, we're going to keep plugging along. I hope you guys are doing well. Make sure to subscribe, comment, engage with each other below, share with your friends. Let's get people involved in this thing. It's going to be fun, and I'm going to do it for a fucking year, so I'm going to be sticking around, so I hope you do too.